In this lecture, we will examine an argument for the existence of God presented by the medieval theologian St. Anselm. His argument is commonly known as the ontological argument for the existence of God, though I do not think that that's an accurate description of this argument, but we'll come back to that later. An ontological argument is an argument that attempts to prove that if we start from the concept of God, we can conclude that God exists. Now, this argument is perhaps one of the most controversial arguments, not only amongst non-theists, or those who don't believe in God's existence, but also among those who do believe in God's existence. My hope for this lecture is to offer an interpretation that is most faithful to St. Anselm, while also steelmanning his argument against common objections. My purpose in trying to steelman the argument is to offer the strongest version of the argument that I can, so that if we reject the argument, it is because the argument is false, and not because we are misunderstanding St. Anselm. It is a general principle in philosophy that if a piece of text can be interpreted in multiple ways, that we should always seek the most charitable interpretation. That way, we are always trying to put the author in the best light possible. Before we begin, we will briefly look at who St. Anselm is, then examine his argument, and finally, we will address common objections to his argument. So first, who was St. Anselm? St. Anselm was a Christian monk who lived in the 11th century. He is sometimes regarded as the father of medieval scholasticism. Scholasticism is a movement that seeks to harmonize faith and reason, philosophy and revelation. He held to a very classically Christian principle, faith-seeking understanding. As a Christian, he already believed in the existence of God. But he didn't want to simply believe blindly. He wanted to understand why he believed that God exists and why Christianity makes sense. St. Anselm's view of philosophy, then, is like a building. Faith is the foundation. Without faith, we cannot have a building. But reason builds on this foundation. Starting from faith, he tries to use reason to show why God exists, and why, if we do not believe in the existence of God, we run into a contradiction. There are then two questions for us to consider. First, does God exist? Second, if God does exist, can we know this through human reason alone? Or is this something that we can only know by religion or faith? These questions matter because they touch on how we are to live our lives, and what we value, and what we think the world ultimately is. Since discovering the right way of life is at stake, we have to pay close attention to what St. Anselm is doing. As we examine the two main questions, we will break down the argument into three main parts. First, there is the religious context. Second, the argument itself. And finally, a moral point, what this means for our own happiness. Now, as I've already alluded to, St. Anselm holds to the principle of faith-seeking understanding. For him, belief in God and revelation comes before fully understanding them. Now, for us today, this doesn't seem to make much sense. Why would we believe in anything if we don't first know it and understand it to be true? But consider how we already put personal faith and trust in each other. For example, in order for this lecture to be fruitful, you have to at least believe and trust that I exist, and that I have read St. Anselm, and that I have something worth listening to. If you don't believe any of these things, then it wouldn't make sense for you to listen to this. Likewise, I have a personal trust in all of you, believing that you exist and that you are listening to this lecture. If I didn't first have that belief and trust, it would make no sense to give this lecture at all. So we all live our daily lives with a kind of natural faith. We do this with history as well. We trust that St. Anselm was really a historical figure. But how do we know that? Through his writings? But then how do we know that those writings are really from St. Anselm and not from someone else? Again, we first believe and trust that he was a real person before we begin talking about him. If then faith comes before understanding, we must first place our faith in God in order to understand him rightly. This doesn't mean that we cannot use reason to explore God's existence. Rather, it means that trust opens us to understand what reason discovers. Trying to understand God without any prior trust is like trying to prove the laws of logic. You can't understand the laws of logic without first using them. Similarly, we cannot understand God without first approaching him in faith. This is faith-seeking understanding. In order to do what St. Anselm wants us to do, which is to give his argument justice, let us at least approach it with an openness to faith, at least enough to see where it leads. The argument itself begins with a description of God. If we are trying to understand God's existence, we have to have at least some idea of what we're talking about. When we think of the concept God, we don't think of just any ordinary thing. We think not only of the greatest thing, but of the source of all greatness. More specifically, we think of that than which nothing greater can be thought. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. That's what we mean by God. Now, this might sound confusing at first, so let's try to clarify the idea. Let's take a number line, for example. Here we have 0 at the center, and integers greater or lesser than 0. We also have infinity and negative infinity at the ends of the number line. Notice how the numbers approach infinity but never reach it. 2 is closer to infinity than 1. 3 is closer to infinity than 2. And 4 is closer to infinity than 3, and so on. So here's the question. What is the greatest number on the number line? Well, we can't say infinity because infinity isn't a number, so it can't be that. In fact, the question is a trick question. There is no greatest number on the number line. Why? Because we can always add 1 to any number to make that number larger. But if we try adding 1 to infinity, we are adding a number, 1, to something that is not itself a number, infinity. So is infinity the greatest possible number? No. It's not the greatest possible number because it's not a number at all. So then what is it? What is infinity? Infinity is that which no greater number can be thought. We know this because if there were a number greater than infinity, that number would have to lie outside of the number line. But if something lies outside of the number line, it is not a number. So there are no numbers beyond infinity. Infinity is that which no greater number can be thought. Notice also that the numbers all tend toward infinity. Some get closer to it than others, even though they are all an infinite distance away from infinity. So without the concept of infinity, would the number line be ordered? No. Infinity gives the number line its direction and its intelligibility. Without infinity, the numbers would have nothing to tend toward. They would lose their ordering. In short, the number line cannot be understood without infinity. And since the number line is real, at least in the same abstract or conceptual sense that numbers are real, then infinity must be real in that same sense. Similarly, we can relate this to our understanding of what we mean by God. God is not merely the greatest possible being. God is greater than even that. Just as infinity is that which no greater number can be thought, God is that which nothing greater can be thought. That is what we mean by God. We mean that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. But how do we understand the description, that than which nothing greater can be thought? This is not a positive description, but a negative one. It's like infinity. Infinity means not finite. So if we don't know what finitude is, then we can't understand what infinity is. Similarly, if we don't understand greater and lesser things that exist, then we can't understand what we mean by that which nothing greater can be thought. To understand what we mean by God, then, we must take what we experience and know from our experience and negate it. Now that might sound a little bit confusing, so let's take a look at an example. Just as we thought of an ordered number line, we can think of an ordered line of beings. Some things exist only as concepts, but are contradictory. For example, squared circles. Even though we can form the idea of one, the concept is self-contradictory. It is impossible for a squared circle to exist. So a squared circle exists only in our understanding and can never exist in reality. This is one kind of being. But there are other kinds of beings as well. Unicorns are similar to squared circles in that they do not exist in reality. They only exist in the mind. But they are unlike squared circles because it is at least possible for unicorns to exist. While there is a contradiction in the idea of a squared circle existing, there is no contradiction in the idea of a unicorn existing. There are also beings with a more complete kind of existence. Rocks, for example. We have concepts of rocks, but rocks also exist in reality. So they have a more complete being than squared circles or unicorns. Again, plants are greater than rocks. Both exist in the mind and in reality, but plants have a more complete existence. Not only do plants exist, but they are also alive. They take in nutrients and they grow. So plants have a more complete being than rocks, unicorns, or squared circles. Human beings are greater still. Plants are living things, but they do not have consciousness. Human beings, on the other hand, can think, reflect, and philosophize. So human beings have a more complete existence than plants, rocks, unicorns, or squared circles. Now, to clarify, this does not mean that human beings who live longer are greater humans. We are not speaking of greatness in terms of quantity. We are speaking of greatness in terms of the kind of being. So now that we have listed some examples of different beings, we can ask, what do they all share in common? They are all beings, of course, but also they either do not exist in reality or they do not have to exist in reality. In other words, these beings are either impossible, like the squared circle, or contingent, meaning that they do not have to exist. For example, unicorns do not have to exist, and in fact, they actually don't exist. Rocks, plants, and human beings also do not have to exist, but in this case, they really do exist. These are all contingent beings. So here we must ask, is there a greater or more complete kind of being than something contingent? And the answer is yes. For example, a necessary being is more complete than a contingent being. While contingent beings do not have to exist, a necessary being must exist. This brings us directly to St. Anselm's argument. Since God is understood to be that than which nothing greater can be thought, God must be greater or more complete than all these beings. God must be greater than squared circles, than unicorns, rocks, plants, and human beings. God must be greater than anything that we experience. Now, if that than which nothing greater can be thought existed only as a concept, then it would lack greatness. It would not be that than which nothing greater can be thought, right? Because it's greater for something to exist in reality than in the mind alone. So if that than which nothing greater can be thought only existed as a concept, then because it would lack greatness, it would be a contradiction. It would contradict itself. We cannot think of something greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought. So therefore, God, the being than which nothing greater can be thought, must not exist only as a concept. God must exist in reality. So just as infinity grounds all the numbers on the number line, God grounds all contingent beings, the beings that do not have to exist. Without infinity, there could be no ordered number line. Similarly, without God, there could be no order of beings. In fact, without God, there could be no beings at all. But since we do experience and know of different kinds of beings, these beings exist because of a necessary being. This being being that than which nothing greater can be thought. So in other words, God must exist. Now, since God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, we might ask, what follows from all this? What does this tell us about God? Well, it tells us that there is no imperfection in God. This is because a being is more complete if it has no imperfections. It also tells us that God must have intelligence and a will. He must be able to know things and to love them, since a being is more complete if it knows and loves. But since God has both an intellect and will, he must also be personal. This is because, again, a being is more complete if it has personhood versus if it doesn't. Thus, St. Anselm does not merely prove that some generic idea of God exists. Rather, he shows that a real and personal God not only exists, but cannot not exist. He proves that God must exist. So now that we have articulated the strongest version of St. Anselm's argument, we will try to articulate and respond to common objections against his argument. First, some object to St. Anselm's argument because they believe that he moves from the concept of God to God actually existing. They say we can't just move from concept to reality. For example, if I imagine that island than which no greater island can be thought, then that perfect island would have to exist in reality. But that's obviously absurd. So, they conclude, St. Anselm's argument doesn't work. But this objection, which was actually raised against Anselm himself during his own day, rests on a false comparison. An island has a definition. It is limited by that definition. For example, while a cat and an island are both beings, they are not the same kind of being. Their definitions limit the kind of being they are. So an island than which no greater island can be thought still has limited existence. An island can always be made greater by adding more features. We can always imagine an island with one more palm tree, or another waterfall, or twice as much gold. Because of this, the very concept of an island than which no greater can be thought doesn't make sense. This greatness in the island is not unlimited. An island is limited by its definition. But God, or that than which nothing greater can be thought, is not limited by anything. Even the phrase, that than which nothing greater can be thought, is not a definition in the usual sense. This is because definitions tell us what things are by placing them into categories. But this phrase tells us what God is not, that God is not limited in any way. So God has no definition because God has no limits to his being. Definition limits being, and God has no limits, therefore he is without definition. The second objection, then, comes from the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant argues that the ontological argument fails because it assumes that existence is an attribute. Red and round might be attributes of an apple, but existence is not an attribute of an apple. We don't describe apples as red, round, and existing. We describe an existing apple or an imaginary apple as red and round. Now, Kant's argument has force against certain kinds of ontological arguments. For example, Kant's objection seems to refute someone like Descartes, who offers his own version of the ontological argument. But Kant does not refute St. Anselm. This is because Anselm is not treating existence as a predicate or an attribute. Instead, St. Anselm treats existence as a mode, the way in which something exists. Some things exist only in the mind. Others exist in reality. And of the things that exist in reality, some are contingent, while others are necessary. Now, since necessary beings ground contingent beings, meaning that they explain why contingent beings that do not have to exist nevertheless do exist, St. Anselm's argument thus sidesteps Kant's objection that existence is a predicate. So now that we have dealt with the objections and the responses to them, we can move to the final point, the moral consequences of St. Anselm's argument. Since God truly exists and has every perfection in him, and since human happiness is found in that which is good and perfect rather than in what is bad and deficient, our happiness is found in loving God. In a previous lecture, we said that the philosopher can be understood as a lover of wisdom, where wisdom is something good and perfect. Now, since the philosopher is a lover of wisdom, and since God possesses this wisdom in its fullness, the philosopher then must ultimately be a lover of God. Loving God is the only way one can attain wisdom. So every philosopher then searches for wisdom, but not every philosopher rests in that wisdom. So through our love of God, we may finally rest in this wisdom. We may have true and everlasting peace. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.